Okay, well, we have a very small group today. I suspect that many of our regular audience members are over in the capital to do what they do. We lived in a democracy. So, but I'm sorry, Professor Khan, that you have a somewhat slimmer turnout than usual. However, there'll be a very good audience to you.
I'm glad that they're there.
Right. I'm really excited. We at the Center for South Asia are always very keenly aware of the fact that we're the Center for South Asia and that there's a whole world beyond India. And we're always very happy when we hear of people who do excellent work on regions outside of India, not to invalidate in any way people that work on India like myself. So today's focus is going to be Bangladesh, and we're really thrilled to have Professor Farida Khan, who is at UW-Parkside, which is in Kenosha, and she has her PhD in economics from the University of Maryland, and she's a professor of economics at UW-Parkside. And I had a look at her publications, and I'm very excited to see there's a lot of work on NGOs in Bangladesh and also a lot of work on gender violence, so they seem to be your particular areas of interest. Some forthcoming articles, household work, labor time, and the schooling of girls in rural South Asia, which is going to be in the Journal of Developing Areas, and also forthcoming the economy of Bangladesh in the 21st century, which is going to be University Press. And I also just wanted to mention some professional offices held by Professor Khan. She's Vice President of the Bangladesh Development Initiative, and she's also on the editorial board of the Journal of Bangladesh Studies. So we have among ourselves a veritable expert. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Okay, well, I've been sort of thinking to myself that the talk that I'll have today is going to perhaps appear journalistic. It did to me. And that's because I will tell you about my research, if we have time, hopefully after I've introduced the context. But simply introducing the context seemed to take quite a bit of time. So I hope that I have framed it in some kind of academic manner. I've been so absorbed with this particular wonder, if you will, of indigenous peoples around Bangladesh for the last 4 or 5 years. It seems that I have rediscovered a new dissertation for myself, and I cannot see myself and what I do with it, or I can't see how I talk about it, so I don't seem to have a distance from it. So I will appreciate any kind of questions or observations you make after I'm done with this. And I hope to God that I'm done in 45 minutes because I'm worried about that. So I will go on. I tried to follow the a little blurb that I sent regarding what the talk would be, and it seemed to focus a little bit on identity. So I'll just start with sort of a background. You know that today the issue of indigenous peoples around the world has a lot of similarities. Even though each group is so different and particular, the circumstances, the sort of hegemonic circumstances, if you will, that they face are quite similar. And hence, there is a similarity of sorts, but there's a lot of difference. And that's what we're sort of after or wanting to know about. So I'm going to go straight into India. And you know, India has a lot of different people, as you know, and they're all defined by caste and community and a lot of intricacies, right? So despite that identification by caste and community, various tribal groups are still marked as being different from plains people. So, you know, in mythically they've been referred to as Athavika or forest dwellers, Vanavasi. And unlike Dalits, these groups have had relative autonomy in pre-colonial times, depending on the region, and they've had different sorts of ways of living, you know, hunter-gatherer, ways, farming economies, etc. I'm not an anthropologist and not pretending to be one. So, anthropologists have studied them to a great degree. Prior in sort of pre-colonial, early pre-Mughal times, Adivasi approval and support was considered crucial by a lot of local kings, and large Adivasi groups had their own kingdoms, like the kingdom of Gondwana, for instance, that you may have heard Arundhati Roy refer to, for instance. Okay. So what happened to these people over time? When the Mughals came in, the Mughals were more actively engaged in the forest. They wanted to hunt, they wanted to extract timber, and then they sort of went in with sort of a willful intent to exploit the forest for its resources. Maybe not as fully as we do now, but it's still a start. And then when the British came in, and with permanent settlement and cutting up the land into properties of different people and introducing a zamindari system, a lot of Adibashi land or Adivasi land did get allocated to, or Adivasis were taxed and they couldn't pay the taxes, so they were indebted and dispossessed of their land. So it's during the British times that Adivasis really felt the pressure of plains land people and had to migrate out of their forests and areas that they lived in. I'm assuming people here have studied South Asia and are familiar with the many revolts that the Adivasis participated in against the British. The Santal Hul is a very famous one, but there's so many others in history. And also the fact that these tribal revolts actually led to extracting some concessions from the British in terms of lowering the tax rate they had to pay, being assured that the headmen of the village decided or negotiated with the landlord what would be paid, etc. So it's not as though these tribal revolts were to naught. They did help the tribal economies, if you will. And here's a picture of the Santal Hul in a potolipi, or basically an indigenous drawing, if you will. And this is the Santals and the guards, as you can see, and it's the story of the Santals rising against the state. And this hul that they had led to the formation of the Santal Pargana Tenancy Act, and it gave, the Santal community and its head quite a bit of rights that they didn't have before. So that's simply indicating that. Now, after, or rather, on the path to independence in India, around the 30s, the term Adivasi came around and started to be used. It was used more as a political term. You are aware of what it means. Adi means old or ancient, and Vas means one who lives. So it basically means autochthonous or indigenous. That term was a more informal one. It's never been really formalized until later. For instance, the Constitution actually defines scheduled tribes, and later writing has introduced the word Adivasi. So scheduled tribes are what Adivasis became in the Constitution, and they are described as such tribes or tribal communities, or part of groups within such tribes or tribal communities as deemed under such and such article. And there is not a particular criteria under which all Adibasis fall. These are some of the criteria that are used. Geographical isolation, that they live, in exclusive, remote areas. Backwardness, that their livelihood is based on primitive agriculture, and they have a low-value closed economy with low levels of literacy and health. They have a distinctive culture and religion, so these communities have, sort of been closed off and evolved on their own, and they have a shyness of contact. Okay, so these 4 criteria are sort of what determines a scheduled tribe, essentially. Now, part of India is, of course, partitioned into East Pakistan and Pakistan. So with partition into East Pakistan, there are a lot of Adivasis in that area. They are unsure of their status because Pakistan is now a new state that's supposed to be a Muslim state. So where do the Adibasis really belong? So it turned out that the Chakmas, who I will talk about coming up, so I'm sorry I'm introducing some of the names beforehand. The Chakmas are the largest Adibasi tribe in Bangladesh. And they raised the Indian flag for 2-3 days. And they felt sort of betrayed by Nehru because somehow they had this idea that they'd be part of India. But they were part of Pakistan, and later in 1971, when Pakistan became Bangladesh, the Chakma head, Tridi Roy, was said to be complicit with Pakistan. So even when Bangladesh came about, there was this sort of he was considered a traitor and not somebody who had fought for Bangladesh. And so the tribals, again, were looked at as people who were not going to participate in this new state. Okay? So Tridi Roy, in fact, was considered an outcast in a way by the state of Bangladesh, and he stayed back in Pakistan. And he has joined the Foreign Service in Pakistan, and right now he heads the Pakistani Buddhist People's Association. I'm not sure how many people there are that belong to that, but nonetheless. So whether it was Pakistan or Bangladesh, there's always been this contestation of who these people are. Do they really belong to the state, or are they foreigners, etc. And there was never a constitutional provision for indigenous people in either Pakistan or Bangladesh, as there was in India. Okay. So what happened during the Pakistan period? Well, right after independence, there was the communists in the Bengal area were quite disappointed with the outcome of independence. And the Communist Party, as well as a lot of Adivasis, got together and said, "Ye azadi, mera azadi nahi," meaning this independence isn't mine or isn't ours. And they had a movement against the state called the Toboggan Movement. It came out of the feudal arrangements that were there regarding tenancy arrangements. If you were a tenant, you had to pay half your crop to the landlord as payment. And the Toboggan Movement, which means 3 divisions, wanted to call for 1/3 of the crop to be paid to the landlord. And so that's the basis for it, but it became something that the communists took part in, and it also became something that wanted to call for a different kind of state altogether. So the Toboggan movement was sort of going out of control, and the Pakistani government really put it down in a very violent way. Okay, so that was one of the things that happened immediately after 47 in Pakistan. The second thing that happened was they carried over the regulations that were there during British times with regard to the forests. So what would be reserved forest, what would be protected forest continued. And I can't go into that. That would be too much to go into all of the rules. But at least there was a continuity of leaving the forest alone, at least on paper. But one of the things that the Pakistani government did in 1965 is build a huge big dam in the Chakma area and flooded the entire valley that they lived in, including the Chakma Raja's house, which went underwater. And it displaced 100,000 Chakmas who went to the other side of the border, and they were refugees there. So this was a very important event. Okay, and then what we see during the Pakistani period is encroachment, etc. We see that right before Bangladesh becomes independent, there is a killing of tribals by the Liberation Army of Bangladesh. So the guerrillas who are fighting to free Bangladesh went and killed a lot of tribals. Okay. Also, as soon as Bangladesh became independent, Sheikh Mujib, who was the father of the nation, the Chakma representative, Manabendra Larma, who was sort of the oldest, the senior most person amongst the Chakmas, came to talk to Sheikh Mujib and said, well, what about us? We are different people, we are not Bengalis. Bangladesh was formed as a country for only Bengalis, so you have to be an ethnic Bengali to be part of Bangladesh. So the Chakma representative told the father of the country, we're not Bengali, what about us? Can you make some provisions for us? And Sheikh Mujib basically told him, my son, you're just a Bengali, go home. And so he went home, but he formed his own party, and he stood in the elections in the region, and he won. So he went back to parliament and kept insisting that Chakmas were different. Now, Chakmas are sizable, and I'll show you that later. Okay, Chakmas were different people from Bengalis. They had different needs. They had to be looked at differently. But Sheikh Mujib and the parliament and the nation would not listen to this. Okay, so there was problems with representation, and instead, what the state did is to Bengalize them or make them more Bengali. They simply started settling people in the regions where the Adibashis lived, in the hills. So that's when the slow encroachment of people into this Chakma area began. This is some of the Chakma areas, and you can see that they're quite different from regular Bengali faces. And then you have, after Sheikh Mujib, if you're familiar with the history of Bangladesh, the next ruler is General Zia, and he's a military ruler, so he goes out and he settles more people in the hills, and this is backed by the army. So the Chakmas have, they really are desperate, and they form a group called the Shanti Bahini, which is an armed insurgency against the state. And so then, the government says, oh, this armed insurgency is really foreign. It's the communists from Burma. It's the Indians across the border. They are the ones who are really waging the war, and they try to sort of treat this as a fight against a foreign enemy, but it's not. Okay, so this continues, and in the meantime, the Chakma Raja Tridev Roy, his daughter Chandra Roy, works in the UN, and she works very much to make sure that there's some sort of representation of indigenous rights from Bangladesh in the UN. And when the UN ILO takes on all of the issues regarding indigenous people, when the UNWIPG is formed, she is very strongly part of all that. So, somebody sort of helping them, a transnational force that's helping the Chakmas in the meantime. So the Chakmas become a very politically astute and strong force. And that's kind of what I'm trying to show you through this story. And in 1997, when democracy comes back, well, it comes back in 1991, but I can't go through all of these dates. But after democracy returns to Bangladesh, there's a peace treaty and trying to sort of integrate better. Okay. The term Adibashi, which is Bengali for Adivasi, okay, where does it come from? In the 60s, all of these tribals were called Upajati. Upajati basically means sub-nation, but is used the same way as ethnic would be. So people are ethnic, but Adibashi is used more recently. It's, I think you can tell, I'll just, hopefully you could tell from the pictures that the people there didn't really look like Bengalis. Could you tell? Okay, good. Because, if they look different, then you can even say that they're sort of something else. Okay. All right, so here, the Adibasis are sort of spread all around the margins of Bangladesh. Okay, I'll show you a better map. This is clearer. So you can see that these are all the Adibasis, all on the fringes. And they have their counterparts on the other side of the border. Okay? So there are basically, what's common about them, all of those Adibasis? They are less than 1.5% of the population. That's about 2 million, which is pretty big for Wisconsin, right? Okay. So they are different in religion from the mainstream because they're mostly Buddhists or some form of animist, Vaishnavites, and so on. But they're not Muslim. Linguistically, they're different. There are 24 distinct major groups and about 52 groups that have been now categorized in the Encyclopedia of Indigenous Peoples in Bangladesh. Okay? They clearly have a marginal status with respect to the state and the economy. That's what they have in common. And they have extremely low levels of literacy and also public service provision, if I might add. Okay? And please pardon me, I am a sort of an economist, so I tend to talk in very social scientific terms, and I apologize for that if that's not a common thing. Now, one thing about Bangladesh is that the population has doubled in the last 35 years. Okay? And it's gone from 75 to 150 million. Okay, so out of 150 million, we have 1.5% are tribals. And that's because there's been a lot of demographic transition in the standard development sense, and also because of the national boundaries that have been created since 47. You cannot migrate out or in, so you're stuck there. It's a very fertile place, and people reproduce a lot. So, so for the tribals or Adibashis, autonomous existences are not possible anymore. There are too many people, and they're coming in. Oh, by the way, do you know that the land size is exactly the same as Wisconsin? Okay. So imagine 150 million people here. Okay. All right. Here we have 6 million, I believe. So encroachment in what forms do we have? Firstly, the tribals have a particular kind of agriculture. They have swidden agriculture. And you need land to practice that, because you have to move on to the next piece. People, there's landlessness. The state wants to do something about the landless people, so they keep bringing them into the tribal areas to resettle them. Easy land. Then there's a lot of demand for fuel wood, because that's what people in Bangladesh, ordinary people, use for cooking. That's a whole different story, but that leads to deforestation. Okay. Then you have the forest department, which has traditionally always gone and had murky relationships with tribals and forests. And the forest department does a lot of illegal logging, then is maybe creating little plantations for somebody and getting side payments for that, etc. So the forest department's activity also leads to a lot of problems. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with an economist who is now Kerala's planning minister, Prabhat Patnaik. Okay. Now, he was just giving a talk 2 weeks ago, and he said that capital always needs non-capital areas for regeneration. And so essentially that's the story that happened over this time, and of course it's happening everywhere else, but I just thought I'd throw that in. The forest department always targets these people. They have a farm. I'm now looking at another area of Bangladesh, but I'm just telling you all across Bangladesh the kinds of things that happen. They make recreational tourist complexes, Air Force for a firing range, then they make something into a national park, but then they bring in truckloads of people and they build rest houses, they create walls and things like that. So the idea of eco parks in Bangladesh are anything but eco, because they completely destroy the way that tribals live. So then in the 80s, a lot of money comes in from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank for reforestation and afforestation programs with participatory development and so on, because Asia is heavily deforested in the 1980s. So the donors want to give a lot of funds for this. So Bangladesh gets some. So all of these funds come in, but then we find that the trees that are planted are completely different from indigenous trees, and they're just sucking up the water. The birds won't come to them. So again, there's more destruction actually with these afforestation programs. There's also a lot of funds that get diverted to logging and plantation. So more stories about these kinds of encroachment, corruption of the state, various things interacting. And only now, only 0.5% of Bangladesh's land is forested. Okay. So that's quite. So here are some pictures of banana farms in place of forests, and then. These are the traditional shal forests that used to be all over Bangladesh. Okay. Then more stories of encroachment, down in the Chittagong hill tracts. Now, I'm not sure that you're familiar with the map of Bangladesh. I'm hoping that you are. And so the hill tracts are down in the south. When I showed the map, perhaps I could have spent more time. Maybe I'll pull it back up if you need. So all of these different things, and they're still going on. The army is still present in the Chittagong hill tracts. Remember, I said that the army had been moved. There was a peace treaty. The army was supposed to go back, but no, they're still there. They're still there every day. The Bengali, the plains people, along with the army, are still burning houses, grabbing land, looting, killing, etc. I get stories every day because I belong to certain organizations that send me this. Okay, and this is the picture of the dam. And this is up in the northeast of Bangladesh, where Khasias, who are also on the other side, live. And their problem is that there are tea plantations in that area, and the tea plantation owners come and just cut down villages in the Khasiya, cut down trees in the Khasiya villages, and just evict the Khassias whenever they feel like. So, that's another problem. So it's all over the country. Now, most of the things I just talked about are about the hilly forest people who are on the eastern side of Bangladesh. They look very Sino-Tibetan in appearance and language, okay? And they have counterparts in Northeast India, and they are 70% of the Adibashis in Bangladesh. So the stories I've just told you are about them, okay? And they practice swidden cultivation. But that wasn't my real story, and I know it took a long time. My story is supposed to be about the Plains Adibashis, but I cannot tell you this story without introducing the previous story, because that is the largest body of Adibashis, and they have politicized and they have waged battles against the state and brought the whole idea of Adibashis to the fore in Bangladesh. So now the Plains Adibashis, called Shamotal or Plains Adibashis, they're not very recognizable in appearance. They look like Bengalis often. So you can't tell all the time that they're Adibashis. And they're on the western side of Bangladesh, okay? And they have counterparts in the mid-Indian region. So mostly they're Santals, Orans, Mundas, Mahatos, Baharis, and various others. But the largest groups are Santals, if you've ever heard of them, and Mundas. Okay, and Orans too. So their languages are different. They're Austroasiatic, like the Santals and Mundas, Dravidian Orans, or Indo-Aryans like the Mahatos. Okay, and they practice paddy farming. They used to live in forests, and then they practice paddy farming. So they basically live lives very much like other Bengali farmers. Okay, so that's what makes them a little different from the hilly people. Okay, now they seem to be, so there's a map up there. So the hilly people were all around here that we talked about. Now we're talking about people here. So they're mostly located in what's called the Bahraini Tract. This is also the area that's really dried up as a result of the Farida Dam, because the river Padma, which flows through around here, has completely dried up, and its tributaries. So it is a very dry, higher, drought-prone area. And there's a new kind of famine or drought that happens in the dry months in the winter, where people are actually starving again, starting in the mid-90s, or early 90s actually. And it has a special name called Monga. So Monga is the new famine that's come around, that, after food self-sufficiency and everything else. It's periodic, it's sporadic, but guess who suffers it the most? Of course, the Adibashis, right? Okay, so the Santals constitute the largest group of the Adibashi population and the majority of the Plains Adibashis. So there's 17% of all Adibashis, and I don't know what percentage of Plains Adibashis, but it would be pretty large. I'd say probably about half or something. Okay, and so this is the area that they live in, and I took some field trips around here to see what that would be like. But I haven't mentioned my own work in all this, so hopefully you'll ask at some point. So the Santals were brought in during the British period for agriculture, indigo crops, installing railway tracks, clearing forest, etc. And then we've discussed how their lands were dispossessed of the land because of the taxes. There was also a lot of land grabbing. Currently, too, there is land grabbing. And currently, there's a huge amount of Islamic fundamentalism in that area. If there is any place in Bangladesh where it's there's violent fundamentalism for the last 20 years, this is it. This is the area. Okay. Then I already talked about the lack of water. So the Santals and others have been reduced to going to a lot of Christian agencies for education, funding, protection, and about 15% of the Santals have converted to Christianity as a result. Here are Santal houses. They're very minimal houses, but I didn't really capture the fact that often they're painted with beautiful patterns. I didn't seem to have a camera when I see these good things. So the houses are a little different from others. They're low. They don't really have too many windows. Okay, also, this is a Santal who has now taken to van driving. These vans are the most common rural transport around Bangladesh nowadays. Some of the other problems that Santals have is they rely very much on herbal medicinal treatments. Those plants are scarce. Land grabbing has also resulted in other villagers of other cultures, mostly Muslim, but even sometimes Hindus, but probably not quite as much. It's mostly Muslim encroachment in the Santal area, coming and taking over their cremation ground and burial grounds and starting to grow paddy there. Okay. There's a lot of alcoholism amongst the Santals, and sometimes, they've signed off their land as a result of their habits. There's also another problem. There's been a need for an open pit coal mine. Bangladesh has the lowest power availability per capita of any country in the world, and it's a large population, growing population. We're supposed to have a lot of gas in Bangladesh, but the gas reserves have been overestimated, and now we see that there's not enough gas. So you need energy from somewhere. So we want to have a open pit coal mine. The coal in the Bahraini Tract that I just mentioned is very good. It's very low sulfur, excellent coal. So the government wants to have an open pit coal mine there. Why an open pit coal mine? Well, if you have an underground coal mine, the extraction rate is something like 30% of the coal. But open pit coal mines can actually extract something like 90%. It's curious that my husband's father has designed open pit coal mines for India and found this out. Because of this, the government wants to have this coal mine, and has this company Asia Energy. It's a British company. I think it's British and Australian. So they've said that these would be all of the benefits you would get, but a lot of people have argued against the coal mine, environmentalists and activists who are particularly interested in protecting the tribals. And they have said that it would destroy the environment, the water, it would basically dig up a whole bunch of villages and so on. And it's mostly Santals and some Mundas that would be affected by this. So I'm not reading all of this, but there's been quite a lot of action against this. And in 2006, there were massive protests against this coal mine and Asia Energy, and then the police opened fire, killing people, etc. This whole matter is still an ongoing thing, and the government seems to have given an okay to the open pit coal mine. So I'm going to move to the southwest of Bangladesh, okay? And that really is where I have been. Now, all these different areas that I mentioned, I've actually taken field trips everywhere over the last 4 years. So I have, a separate chapter on each thing. And I wasn't sure how to present all this to you, so I apologize if I've overloaded you in any way. Okay. So down in the southwest, are the Sundarbans, and they're wonderful, they're beautiful places. The Sundarbans are the largest naturally occurring mangrove forest, and it is the biodiversity of the area is quite incredible, and a lot of these things are already starting to disappear because of the amount of stress on the environment. But you've heard of the Bengal tiger, and that's where the Bengal tiger lives. And what's the reason for the deforestation? Again, population growth, poaching, forest department. Then this new thing down there, this is the delta, and so this is where all the rivers from the Himalayas meet the Indian Ocean. And there's quite a lot of salinity in that area, brackish water. The same kind of water that, if you are aware of, some of you are involved with Kerala, you have these backwater rides, that's also on brackish water. So that's a good place to do shrimp farming. And since the 80s, as Bangladesh has become a state and is trying to develop and needs foreign exchange, shrimp farming has come around. Okay, the local economy has always consisted of these people, no shrimp farmers in the local original economy, even though there was a survey done in 2008 that found these categories. But these are the people who lived in the forest, and this is the forest economy. Okay, golpata. Golpata is a particular palm. This thing. See how big it is. Okay, what's it used for? Well, mostly the roofs of your houses, and it's much better than straw. It's very strong, actually. So this is, and it has many other uses. Golpata is sort of the treasure, one of the treasures from the Sundarban. It's like neem, Neem has 100 uses. It's the neem of Sundarbans, if you like. So the group that lived here are the Mundas. There are only about 4,000 of them now. A lot of them went to the other side of the border over time too, even though some came back, etc. But the Mundas really consisted initially of the forest economy. They were brought by landlords to clear the forest during the British period. Okay, but they never registered as a group. Nobody really knew about them until quite recently. They have a large counterpart in Jharkhand in India, the new state. In fact, that's the state of the Mundas, if you will. But in the Sundarbans in Bangladesh, they're tiny, 4,000 or so. Okay, so what has happened to them? Why am I talking about them? Because they are my particular interest, actually, and I've sort of focused on them more recently. They used to be part of the forest. Then they started growing their own paddy. Then they lost their land, and they have now become wage laborers. So I was trying to look at their assets, and well, the knowledge of the forest was their primary asset, but the new generation doesn't know anything about that, so it's gone. And what about land? 30% of Mundas had agricultural land, according to a 2001 survey. By 2007, only 5% had agricultural land. So I'm trying to look at the economy of the Mundas right now and see what I can glean from how their community is doing economically, and perhaps what strategies they should take to survive or integrate and perhaps preserve themselves. When I went down there, you'll see that they were under great distress and they had to move. And when I asked them about moving, they said, wherever we move, we want to move together. So self-preservation is a big interest of theirs too. So Mundas, they get paid much less than others, and they are used for very, very unskilled, basic kinds of work. They do the same kind of things as Shantals, but Mundas are more forest people, and they are definitely far more denigrated, and because they're small in numbers, they are not very strong. They're considered meek and shy, but that's probably because they're small. Okay. They are, of course, very indebted because during periods of the year they can't find any work and they have to take loans. Look at the rates of repayment. These are not repayment rates. I don't know why I wrote repayment. Interest rates are 100 to 300%. So, during very bad times, the money lenders go looking for mundas because they're good to lend to. They normally live on public land. And if you talk to older mundas, they'll talk about how they were brought in a particular area to do work, and people said, "Oh, we'll give you land." And mundas always, they always mean what they say. So, even over time, they have not learned that others may not mean what they say. So that's there. Then there's land grabbing that happens, and land grabbing because of the shrimp very much. Also, they've been removed from the forest, and now to go to the forest, you need permits. Mundas can't afford permits, which is why they've lost the knowledge of the forest. Okay? Their consumption is a little strange. They eat various types of things that the mainstream doesn't, including field rats, which is why they're looked down upon very much. They they cook with rice straw, they harvest rainwater when they can, and increasingly the water has become very saline in the area, and so they have to go very far to fetch water. Okay, they have to walk sometimes for 2 hours just to get a jug of water. Their literacy is very low. They don't have much to speak of in terms of human capital. When they go to school, they're not really taught, but they are asked to be there because the public school people want to say that they're teaching many students, so they count it. They have a lot of sanitation and hygiene problems. It looks like I'm kind of pushing it, so I'm going over this quickly and will simply answer what you asked me in detail. They have child marriage systems which still go on, and often the girls will have babies at the age of 12 and 13, so there's a very high mortality rate of these mothers. But the younger generation that's sort of trying to break away from some of these habits, now they don't really want to learn their own language, and they're even considering marrying outside of their community. Now, some of the things that have made problems for them is the construction of embankments in the area to keep the saline and the seawater out, which has led to water logging. And you can't really grow paddy in that very well. So the disappearance of appropriate water, destruction of paddy, disappearance of potable water, disappearance of wage labor opportunities in rice farming is what has really hit them very much. The shrimp farming that has come in requires 1/10 of the labor that rice farming does. So that's problematic. These are essentially a catalog of those effects of shrimp farming on the area. And the mundas have organized, these are my informants, if you like, my friends. And they form the Sundarban, Adibashi, and Munda Shomiti, or Shangsta. And they're guided by Father Luigi from Italy, who's actually opened up 9 schools for Munda villages. So they're a good force down there. But, there's been recently a lot of coastal storms, the Sidr and the Isla. So, those, the whole place is, I had gone there to do some research, and I built my questionnaires and everything, and I went there, and I found that there was no economy, okay? And that there was nothing, there was no consumption, there was no income, there was just waiting and watching the water, there's not even firewood to cook with. So in the refugee camps where Mundas were, they were drying the twigs on the roof and then using that to cook a little bit, and whatever they could essentially gather, etc. So this is the condition really of most of the Mundas, but some of them have been resettled into certain villages or gone to join families when they could. But my question is, what will happen to them now? Will there be possibilities to go back to the forest or go back to agriculture? Will they be given some kind of way so that they can autonomously return to some kind of calling? Okay. Much of this depends on the national rights conferred to Adibashis in general, okay, and to the Mundas in particular. The other option, of course, is that Mundas might, get into shrimp farming. Doubtful. They don't have the capital, and you need a lot of security. Because shrimp farmers in that area, another whole story, is that there's a lot of violence, and you need a lot of protection to maintain your shrimp farms and to extend them. They don't have much human capital, so where will they work? The social fabric seems to be falling apart because the youth, some of them get educated, they want to marry people outside of the Munda community, okay? But will they wind up being in Dhaka, which is a mega city now of 10 million people with all these climate refugees? Is that what's going to happen to them? I mean, is that the kind of assimilation that there will be for the Mundas, and is that the new identity? So those are the questions that I'm kind of asking as, we all see this kind of thing, and the Mundas are watching everything go. So I'm sorry if I took very long, but if you have specific questions, then I can address them.
If I may just use my role as introducer and start off the questions, and I have to go and teach, but the questions can keep going for a little, maybe for 5 or 10 minutes after one, just to make sure that everybody who can stay gets a chance. And also Professor Khan has very kindly agreed to, if you'd like to join her for lunch after, then that is a possibility. We are unfortunately not funding that. I see Mark, look at me. But you can talk to Mike, and then we can organize that. So that is so. Thank you for being willing to do that. Right, I have 2 questions. One is, who eats these shrimp? Is that a very popular dish in Bangladesh, or is it exported out? And the other question, if I may just ask, is the literacy. You said it was very low, and then you had a figure of 65%, which seems rather high to me in context of South Asia. So those are my questions.
I apologize. 65% was illiteracy. I'm terrible with numbers, given that I'm an economist. 65% was illiteracy. And in Bangladesh, now the literacy rate has actually increased quite a bit. It's gone up to about 60%.
Right. So 65 seemed good, but 35%.
So 40% would be the illiteracy of the nation as a whole. And the Munda illiteracy is 65.
Right, that makes
so
more
the negative.
sense.
Yes. And the second question about shrimp.
Who eats the shrimp?
Shrimp is it used to be eaten by us and people when I was a child, so back in the 70s and even early 80s. But shrimp started being exported around mid-80s. Okay. And it's Bangladesh's second or third largest, the largest foreign exchange earner is garments, and then it's remittances from other countries, and the third might be shrimp.
Okay. Thank you.
I've been interested in the kind of, so I've been trying to read up on the Criminal Tribes Act and the criminal caste and tribes. So the ways that these groups that don't fit into Indian society have certain ethical judgments made about them, that because they don't fit into landed economy, that they're they're somehow, they're number one backward, but also that they have kind of hereditary criminal tendencies. They're lazy. They don't know the value of education. All these I mean, these go back to kind of Vedic times, but the British take them up, and so it's like a kind of never-ending kind of thing that the people in power look down on Adibasis as these different things, as lazy, as criminal. I wonder if you came across any of that in Bangladesh. Do Muslim people also have the same kind of prejudices against Adibasis? The mainstream society, how does the mainstream society look on them, their economy, their societies? Do they see them in these kind of negative ways as well?
So mythically, yeah, you sort of think of these people as being perhaps, lazy and their different characterizations. But what's interesting is how does the modern economy look upon them? In India, you might see less Adivasis in the modern economy, even though you're seeing them in the last 10 years or so. There are more Adivasis coming out, and they actually are working in the modern economy. But in Bangladesh, you see that a lot because, there's been so much encroachment. And so how are they considered in the modern economy, one might ask? They're actually considered to be very hardworking, very honest. So people hire them immediately. And particularly if there's some kind of donor funding of anything or any foreigners present, they somehow think of the northeast and the eastern Adibashis that look sort of Sino-Tibetan. I think they think of them as extra hardworking just because they look that way, and so they hire them immediately. And that has sort of passed down to other middle-class Bangladeshis. So you will see them largely occupied as domestic, maids, cooks, guards, and you obviously, if you're going to hire unknown people, you would try to pick from a community that you think is trustworthy. So yeah. It's interesting that, no, they're not thought to be criminal.
But I mean, to follow up on that, do you think that's related to what you mentioned about these groups generally earning less money for similar types of work? I think you had one slide where they earn between 40 and 60 taka or something, when the regular local going rate would be 75 to 100. Do you think that actually factors into why they're sought out for
that is
work,
still the old economy operating, where you're discriminating and giving less to these tribals who are working for you. There's a new economy where you can perhaps sell yourself as not one of those Bangladeshis that you can't trust, but a slightly more trustworthy, hardworking, honest Bangladeshi. And if you can tap into that, and then you can earn more. Also note that a lot of Adibashis have converted to Christianity, so they have some transnational connections that they've made that allow them some networking and human capital that they can transfer back into the modern economy, especially if they're literate. But if they're not literate, it's going to be hard to do that. So yes, Adibashis do like a lot of NGOs because they hope that maybe they can make some inroad into the modern economy through them. But there's also this other problem, is that they get transformed as they enter into contact with NGOs, and they start losing their language. For instance, Santals. If you look at the third generation of Santal Christians, they don't really speak Santali. And I mean, not only have they changed their names, but they're speaking in Bengali, and they have learned some English words too. So what do we make of that? I mean, there's economic betterment, but then there's a cultural problem or lack of preservation.
You always hear of groups referred to as Adibasis, Adibashis, tribals, what have you. It is sort of, as you said, a political term that has arisen in the last 100 years or so. Is there any effort on the part of groups that are considered Adibashis to sort of appropriate that identity as a basis for sort of larger political advocacy? Because it seems like a lot of the problems that are that they're plagued with are associated or related to sort of disenfranchisement. And you also sort of portrayed it as a very diverse group of peoples. So have they sort of taken an effort to adopt Adibashi as another identity that they can use as a political advocacy?
Absolutely. So the Chakmas started out by saying, hey, we're different from Bangladeshis, so at least, acknowledge us. When that didn't happen, and the whole, fighting back at the state didn't help, then they took on, through the UN and the indigenous peoples, they started calling themselves Adibashis. It was a natural because it was happening in India, right? So it's Chakmas that use the political term Adibashis instead of Upajatis to make a claim for their place in the constitution. By the way, I didn't add that only starting last October, there's a movement to put them in the constitution now. And then these other people, the Plains people, they're very small, not very organized, but they somehow got organized under this whole by the way, I didn't mention that I've been very active with Adibashis. And I actually organized in Bangladesh, there's a group called the Bangladesh Environmental Network, which has a counterpart in Bangladesh called the Preserve the Environment in Bengali, Bangladesh Poribesh Andolon. Okay, so they were mostly concerned about environmental things. I introduced to them the idea that maybe we should also look at people, Adibashis, because they're connected to the environment. So I actually organized through Ben and Bapa the first nationwide Adibashi forum in Dhaka in 2007 end. So all these different Adibashis came together and they realized, wow, we can be a political force. And there have been other people who have done this kind of thing. So yes, even the Plains Adibashis, the little ones, have now tried to organize themselves as this force. But there's some infighting. So I went out to the Chantal area and the Munda area, the pictures that I've shown you. And they asked me, Appa, they call you Appa, like Didi, big sister. The Chakmas and all those people, they should be called Upajatis, don't you think? And we should be called Adibashis, because after all, we were really the original inhabitants of Bengal. And those people migrated from like South China. So, I didn't think that was a good way to go. But, I said, sure, there is a perhaps more plain, but, we should all collaborate and sort of group together. So yeah, that's exactly what's going on. And then that's, so my plan is to be a consultant for the Munda community. And I'm not going to be paid, obviously. That's fine. It sounds like a more fun job than the World Bank's consultant. So, and by the way, this is how I discovered the whole thing, is that I was consulting for the World Bank, and I sort of encountered the Chittagong Hill Tracts problem, and one thing led to another.
You in one of the slides, you had mentioned that as the Bangladeshi population grows, the option for autonomy sort of decreases. I was wondering if you could talk at all. You spoke at length about some of the external factors that lead to sort of the eroding of the economic and social systems of these communities. Do you talk about what are some of the internal dynamics that resist integration? And then secondly, in terms of a diasporic identity, if the Mundas do actually identify with some of the same struggles that are going on in Jharkhand, and if they appropriated any of the discourses of Adivasi autonomy that come up in central and northern India, or the Chittagong Hill Tracts, or if primarily because of their economic situation, they are looking more towards a future of integration.
Well, one about the internal, dynamics, because the external dynamics are so strong and overwhelming, it's difficult to know what those internal dynamics are. I will have to be frank with you. I would have to live with them to find that out. And I haven't seen any anthropologists really talk about that, but perhaps it's a shortcoming in my reading too. There's been a lot of work done on the Chakmas, okay? But lately I have completely ignored them, and I haven't read all of the anthropological tracts perhaps on the Chakmas. There could be something there. But internal forces, one thing I did see from the Mundas is that the younger generation, does want to assimilate. They've forgotten the forest, right? So would we, that's external, isn't that? That's called a cost and internal strife. So they want the benefits of development. You go to a Santali or a Mundari village, the women there say that, oh, we want our kids to go to school, we want TV so that they will know more about the world, and but you're thinking, oh, but what would that do? But then you're thinking, am I right in thinking that they shouldn't have this, or what am I doing? So yeah, I think it's more the forces of modernization rather than anything internal, because they are so cohesive against a sea of people who are looking down on them and are hostile to them. Even the Hindus are hostile to the Adibashis. I went to a Siva temple, okay, with a Santal, and there was a priest there, and he's Brahmin, and he allowed me in and did not allow the Santal in. Okay. So, it's what was the second question?
Diasporic identity, and if the Mundas identify at all with some of the struggles for political autonomy that take place in India or in the Toboggan hill tracts.
Only mythically. There's no connection really. The border is not that porous, it seems, for the Santals and the Mundas. It seems to be more porous on the eastern side, where there are refugees on the other side, and there's a lot more crossing. But and there's more organization in the terms of on the part of the Chakmas. And the Shanti Bahini did get arms for across the border. So there is more political organization on that side, but not on this side. And recently I've been working with somebody from West Bengal who we're thinking of maybe actually trying to build some relationships amongst organizations that exist. Sometimes you have to actually just bring them together, and then it all happens. So.
I think there's one more question, then we should probably.
What did you say the land that has been taken from the Mundas has mostly been used for? Is that shrimp farming? Is that what the land you said?
Yes.
Okay.
That whole area has converted itself to shrimp farming. So, what you see here, there used to be these dikes that were built, and you were supposed to do paddy farming inside that, but the dikes broke and all the saline water is in there. So it's going to be a shrimp farming haven coming up once the water recedes a little bit. It'll be just perfect for shrimp. And so, there'll be a lot of growth in the shrimp production. And we might all have cheaper shrimp. So.
And also, how much, you mentioned in the Northwest that the establishment of eco parks has been sort of a problem in dispossession of land. Is that, is that mostly in that area, or is it all over?
The eco parks, I'm just trying to go back to the eco parks there's one in this area, there's one in this area, one in this area. Those are parks. And they want one down in the hill tracts too. And actually in my Munda area, they've built an eco resort where you can have a view of the sea, and then you could go boating and things like that. It's quite nice. I think it's like $120 per night, which is kind of steep for Bangladesh, but it is quite beautiful. So, and the design was actually done by some locals, and students from Cornell that went down there and helped design it.
Okay, so let's thank